They said it would rot underground. Then the whole ridge came begging.
The winter that nearly broke Duluth began the same way all the worst winters begin. Not with a storm, with silence. But that comes later. First, there is a girl standing on a dirt road in August holding $15 in a canvas bag, watching the door of her stepfather's house stay closed behind her. Leona Grady was 21 years old. She weighed perhaps 105 pounds. She had been awake since before dawn, had cooked breakfast for the household, had swept the porch, and had then stood in the kitchen while Alistair Greer laid the $15 on the table between them without looking at her face. Alistair was not a cruel man. That was perhaps the most difficult thing about him. A cruel man gives you something to push against. Alistair Greer was simply practical in the way that frontier men learned to be practical, which meant he counted mouths at the table and counted cords of wood in the yard and counted the months between now and spring, and when the numbers did not balance, he made adjustments. Leona was an adjustment. $3 a month to feed a person through a Minnesota winter. 4 months of hard cold, maybe 5. That was $12 to $15 for a girl who was not his blood, not his legal obligation, and not something he had signed up for when he married her mother 2 years prior. He had done the arithmetic. The arithmetic had come out the same way every time he ran it. He put $15 on the table. 3 years of labor, he said, deserves something. Leona looked at the money. She thought about what 3 years of labor actually looked like. The cooking and the cleaning and the garden and the wood hauling and the water carrying and the mending and the preserving and the 100 other tasks that kept a frontier household running. She thought about what $15 bought. Then she thought about what her father had told her once during a long winter afternoon in his workshop when she was maybe 14 years old and asking why the world seemed to work the way it did instead of the way it should. Stellan Grady had looked up from the piece of timber he was examining and said something she had not fully understood until much later. He said, "Do not waste your strength fighting battles the ground has already decided. Find the ground that has not been decided yet. Go there instead." Leona picked up the $15. She picked up her canvas bag. She said very quietly that her father had thought differently about the matter of what labor was worth. Then she walked out. Her mother was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, not in the main doorway, not coming to see her off, just visible through the kitchen entrance, a silhouette holding a dish towel. Leona stopped for 1 second. Her mother did not move. Leona turned and walked down the road toward Duluth 4 miles away and did not look back again. The road was dry, August hardpack, and the trees on either side of it were full and green, in the way Minnesota trees are full, and green in August, heavy with a summer they know is already ending. Leona walked and did not think about where she was going to sleep that night, or what she was going to eat, or what came next. She thought about her father. Stellan Grady had come to Minnesota from the Czech lands in 1865, the year Leona was 8 years old. He had been a forestry worker in the old country, which was not the same as being a lumberjack or a mill hand. A forestry worker managed forests the way a farmer manages soil, with attention to long cycles and slow processes, and the kind of patience that comes from understanding that the thing you plant today is not for you, but for the people who come after. He had brought that understanding with him across the ocean, the way some men bring tools or money or a particular skill. Stellan brought a way of seeing wood. He had worked the timber around Duluth for 5 years. He understood the Minnesota forest differently than the men who worked alongside him, saw things in the grain and the moisture and the seasonal behavior of the trees that others walked past without noticing. He died in the winter of 1870 from tuberculosis, which did not care about what he understood or did not understand. Leona was 18. She remembered everything he had taught her. There was one conversation she remembered more clearly than the others. It had happened on a January afternoon when the cold outside was serious enough to keep them indoors, and Stellan had been examining a piece of freshly cut timber, turning it in his hands, pressing his thumb against the end grain the way he always did when he was reading wood. He had looked at Leona and said, "Sit down. I want to show you something." He took a feed receipt from the shelf, an old one blank on the back, and he began to draw. Not a picture exactly, more like a diagram, lines and angles and arrows showing movement. He explained as he drew. "Freshly cut wood is wet," he said, "not damp. Wet. When you fell a tree and cut it into logs, what you have is wood that carries 50 to 100% of its own weight in moisture, sometimes more water than wood by measure. You cannot burn that wood efficiently. Most of the heat your fire produces goes straight into evaporating that water before any warmth can come out. 1 pound of dry, seasoned wood brought down to 15 or 20% moisture gives you close to 8,000 units of heat. 1 pound of green wood freshly cut gives you barely 4,000. You burn twice the wood. You get half the warmth. The poor man cuts green wood and burns it because he has no choice, and it costs him twice what it should cost in wood and in cold and in the slow, miserable creep of a cabin that never gets truly warm. The conventional solution was outdoor seasoning. Stack the wood in a sheltered place, let air and time do the work. Wait 6 months. Wait 12 months if you could. The wood dried down slowly. Eventually it burned properly. The problem in Minnesota, Stellan said, was that outdoor seasoning barely worked. Rain re-wet the wood. Snow re-wet it. In hard freezes, the moisture inside the logs froze and expanded and cracked the wood fibers, internally damaged. You could not see from outside, damage that made the wood burn badly even after it finally dried. Most families managed by cutting enormous quantities of wood in summer and burning through winter on stocks that were partly wet, partly damaged, inefficient, and wasteful and expensive. He had seen something different done in the Czechlands, he said. Foresters who needed reliable dry wood through brutal winters had developed a system. You season the wood underground in a tunnel dug horizontally into a hillside, not a root cellar dug down from above. A tunnel going sideways into the slope following the natural grade upward at a gentle angle. He drew the tunnel on the receipt. He showed the entrance at the bottom of the slope facing south, catching more solar warmth during the day. He showed the vent shaft at the far end, rising up through the earth to break out on the shaded north-facing upper slope, always cooler. The temperature difference between the warm, south-facing entrance and the cool, north-facing vent drove air continuously through the tunnel, warm air rising, cool air sinking, a slow, steady current that carried moisture away from anything stored inside. No fan, no pump, no mechanical help of any kind. Just the slope and the sun and the basic behavior of warm and cool air. The constant temperature underground, never freezing in winter, never warming in summer, meant wood dried without the freeze-thaw damage that ruined outdoor stocks. Green wood placed on racks inside the tunnel kept off the floor so air could move beneath and around it, seasoned down to proper burning condition in 4 to 6 weeks. A fraction of the time outdoor seasoning required. Stellan folded the receipt and put it in Leona's coat pocket. He said, "We will do this someday when we have a proper hillside." They never did. He was dead 14 months later. Leona had kept the receipt in her pocket for 3 years, not because she lacked a better place to put it, because she did not want it anywhere else. She arrived in Duluth with $15 in a folded piece of paper and a clarity of purpose that she recognized even then as something her father had left her as deliberately as the diagram itself. The purpose was simple. She needed a hillside. The land office in Duluth was a small building on the main street with a clerk who had seen enough strange requests to not be surprised by much. Leona asked about inexpensive unclaimed land with a significant slope. The clerk looked at her, a young woman alone with a canvas bag, and then looked at his records without asking the questions he was clearly thinking. There was a 5-acre parcel 2 miles outside town, he said. Glacial ridge, steep slope, poor soil, no flat ground worth farming. It had been listed for 2 years at $6 with no buyers. He slid the map across the counter and waited. Leona looked at the map. The parcel ran along a ridge with a clear north to south orientation, the lower portion facing south, the upper portion facing north. The slope looked steep enough to drive convection, but not so steep that tunneling would be unstable. The soil description said glacial, to which meant clay and sand and gravel, hard but workable. She looked up and said, "This is exactly what I need." The clerk looked at her for a moment. He asked with genuine curiosity rather than condescension what she planned to do with a steep hillside of bad soil. Leona said only that the land suited her purposes. She put $6 on the counter. On her way out of Duluth, she'd bought basic supplies, nails and rope, and a few tools she did not already have, and she walked the 2 miles to her new 5 acres in the late afternoon light. She stood at the base of the ridge and looked up the slope and thought about Stellan standing in his workshop drawing lines on a feed receipt, and she felt for the first time since leaving Alistair Greer's kitchen that morning that the ground beneath her feet was solid. She had $9 left. She had the hillside. She had the knowledge. She had the work ahead of her, which was the only part she could control. The first neighbor arrived the next morning. Taft Dace was 38 years old and farmed the land immediately adjacent to Leona's parcel to the east. He appeared at her rough camp with a loaf of bread in the manner of a man being friendly, which Leona recognized within the first 2 minutes as something slightly different from actual friendliness. He asked how much money she had left. He asked what she planned to grow on land that steep. He asked whether she had family nearby who could help her if things went wrong. These were the questions of a man running calculations, not the questions of a neighbor welcoming someone new. Taft had a wide face and eyes that moved a little too quickly over her camp, over the tools she had laid out over the slope of the ridge behind her. He smiled often. She noticed that the smile reached his mouth reliably, but traveled no further. She answered his questions briefly and honestly. She told him she planned to live on the property through winter and that she was confident she could manage it. She did not tell him what she planned to build in the hillside. She did not know him well enough to tell him that, and some part of her, some instinct she trusted without being able to name it, suggested that knowing too much too soon was not in her interest with this particular man. Taft finished his bread visit and then said almost as an afterthought that he had actually been hoping to buy this parcel himself for a while now. He had been saving toward it. He had been just short of the money when she had come along and purchased it. He understood completely. He said that it was hers now. But if she ever found herself in a difficult position through the winter and wanted to sell, he would give her $7, a dollar profit for her trouble. He said it pleasantly, the way a man says something he wants you to think he doesn't particularly care about. Leona thanked him for the bread and said she expected to be fine. Taft nodded and walked back toward his farm. She watched him go. The offer would still be available. He called back without turning around if she changed her mind. She built the cabin in the first 2 weeks of September, $8 of her remaining $9. Rough-hewn timber construction, a simple peaked roof, a single fireplace, 140 square feet of living space. Crude and small and functional. The point was never the cabin. The point was the hillside behind it. She spent the rest of September studying that hillside before she moved a single shovel of earth. Stellan had been precise in what he described, and precision required understanding, not just memorization. She walked the slope in the morning and watched where the light fell first and longest. She stood at the base in the evening and felt where the cold air pooled. She poured a small amount of water at different points along the grade and watched where it ran and how fast. She was learning the slope the way Stellan had taught her to learn any piece of ground, not by looking at it, but by paying attention to what it did. The excavation began in the first week of October. Digging horizontally into a hillside is not the same as digging a well or a root cellar. You are not fighting straight down against gravity. You are fighting sideways against compacted earth, and the earth does not want to become a tunnel. Every foot forward required removing 30 cubic feet of glacial till a mixture of clay and packed sand and occasional fist-sized rocks left by glaciers 10,000 years before anyone thought to build anything in Minnesota. Each shovelful weighed 12 to 15 pounds. Each forward foot took hundreds of them. Leona was 105 pounds and 5 feet 4 inches tall. She had been doing heavy labor since she was old enough to carry a bucket, and she was stronger than she looked, which was the kind of strength that comes from sustained work rather than from size. But this excavation was beyond anything she had done before. She worked from first light until she could not see. She broke the ground with a pickaxe and moved it with a heavy spade and hauled the excavated earth out in buckets, dumping it down the slope. In the evening, she sat in the cabin with her hands wrapped in cloth because the blisters on her palms had gone through their first cycle and were working on their second. Her back sent complaints that started somewhere around mid-morning and did not stop until she fell asleep. She did not allow herself to think about whether she could finish before the ground froze. She thought only about the next foot of tunnel, the next bucket of earth, the next morning. The shape of the tunnel as she dug it roughly oval in cross-sections 6 feet wide at the base, narrowing to 4 feet at the top, 5.5 feet high at the center. She could stand upright in the middle. The floor she leveled carefully, not perfectly flat, but smooth enough to roll logs across without them catching. The walls she lined with rough-hewn timber planks as she went vertical boards, set against the earth and held in place by horizontal cross members, notched into the tunnel walls every 2 feet. The ceiling she built from heavy timber beams laid side by side, solid enough to carry the weight of the earth above, with clay packed tight between them to seal against moisture seepage. Reverend Theron Harwell arrived on a gray Thursday in late October. He was 55 years old and had been the minister of the only church within 10 miles for the past 12 years. He was not a harsh man. He believed in hard work and in community and in the natural order of things, which in his understanding included the idea that a young woman alone on a hillside spending her last dollars on a hole in the ground represented a situation that called for pastoral guidance. He arrived with a sympathetic expression and an assumption of authority that he wore as naturally as his coat. He told Leona he had heard about her situation and wanted to help. He knew several families who needed help with cooking and household work through the winter. Steady wages, warm shelter, proper arrangements. He could make introductions. Leona set down her pickaxe. She looked at him steadily. She said, "My father was a forestry worker. He taught me what I am building here. I am building the thing he taught me." Harwell nodded slowly, the nod of a man being patient. He said, "Your father has passed. The things we remember our loved ones saying are not always exactly what they said. Memory is tender and sometimes not fully accurate, especially when we are grieving." Leona was quiet for a moment. The silence was not comfortable. Then she said, "My father was never wrong about wood." Harwell looked at her. She was not raising her voice. She was not defensive. She was simply stating something she knew to be true in the tone of someone stating that water runs downhill. He said he would check back in a few weeks to see how she was managing. He put on his hat and walked back down the slope. Leona watched him go, and then she picked up the pickaxe and went back to work. But as she worked through the rest of that afternoon, Harwell's words moved through her mind the way a splinter moves, not painful enough to stop everything but present. She had been so certain. She had been certain every day since she walked away from Alistair Greer's table. But she had never actually tested what she was certain about. She was working toward a test, digging toward it, foot by foot, but the test had not yet arrived. And now a man she did not respect had planted a question she could not entirely dismiss. She worked until dark and did not answer the question that evening. She would answer it the only way it could actually be answered. The tunnel was finished by the last week of October. 18 feet into the hillside, climbing at a gentle upward angle, the walls and ceiling sound and solid. At the far end, she dug a vertical shaft 8 inches square upward through 4 feet of earth to break out on the upper slope in full shade. The south-facing entrance had a sturdy timber frame and a door that could be opened or closed. She built the interior racks from split timber, simple frames that held logs 6 inches above the floor on all sides. Stellan had been specific about this wood needed air underneath it as much as around it, and any surface contact would hold moisture. She tested the airflow with a small smoke fire at the entrance. The smoke drifted in, moved slowly but continuously through the tunnel, and emerged from the vent shaft on the upper slope. The physics were working. The temperature difference between the sunny lower entrance and the shaded upper vent was doing exactly what Stellan's diagram had described. She began filling the tunnel with green wood fresh-cut logs from the trees she had felled on the ridge throughout September and early October. She had hauled and rolled perhaps 2 cords onto the racks inside logs spaced for air circulation, the tunnel full but not packed tight. Then she closed the entrance door, left the upper vent open, and walked back to the cabin. The first 2 weeks, the logs looked exactly as they had when she carried them in. Damp and heavy, and the dark color of freshly cut timber. She checked every few days, opening the door, reaching in to touch the wood. Still wet to the touch, still smelling of cut sap, still exactly what green wood looks and feels and smells like. She had been so sure. Standing at the land office, looking at that map, she had been so sure. Walking the slope through September, she had been sure. Driving the pickaxe through October, she had been sure. And now 2 weeks in, the logs sat in the dark tunnel, looking completely unchanged, and the question Harwell had left behind like a splinter was pressing a little harder. Midway through November, Eugenia Strom arrived. Eugenia was 43 years old, sharp in the way that women who have had to be sharp become sharp. And she was the wife of Emmett Strom, who owned the largest woodyard and lumber operation in Duluth. She organized things. She organized the church social calendar and the winter aid committee and the informal network of women who kept track of who in the surrounding area needed watching over. Leona was on that list. She brought 4 women with her, all wives of men with established properties, and they arrived on a gray November afternoon when the wind was cutting down off the ridge with the first real teeth of approaching winter. They were not unkind women. They were women who believed they understood how things worked and who had looked at Leona's property from the road and seen no woodpile and drawn the obvious conclusion. Leona invited them inside. The fireplace was burning a fire she had built from the small cache of seasoned wood she had purchased before winter enough to get by until the tunnel produced its own. The cabin was perhaps 58 degrees adequate. Eugenia looked around, looked out the window, looked back at Leona. She said, "We have been watching your property for 2 months. You have been cutting trees on that ridge every week. We have seen you hauling logs. There is a no wood pile anywhere on your land. No stack, no split wood, nothing." Leona said she stored the wood in the hillside. Eugenia said she was talking about a tunnel in the ground. Leona said yes. Eugenia's expression shifted. Not to cruelty, but to something more difficult to argue against genuine concern delivered from a position of assumed superiority. She said that wood stored underground would rot. The ground was damp. Underground was always damp. She said it clearly and with the patience of someone explaining something to a person who did not understand. And she said that Leona was young and alone and doing something she had never seen done, and that what she had built would not save her, and that proper arrangements could still be made if Leona would accept help. Leona said, "My father taught me this system. He learned it from foresters in the Czech lands who had used it for generations. The tunnel has continuous airflow driven by the slope. The wood dries underground because the temperature never freezes the moisture inside the fibers." Eugenia looked at her for a moment. Then she said in a voice that had gentled but not retreated, "Your father taught you this." Leona said yes. And Eugenia said quietly that she understood, that the things our fathers teach us feel certain in a way that nothing else does. That memory of the people we have loved is tender and sometimes not entirely precise. It was almost exactly what Harwell had said, and it landed differently hearing it a second time in a warmer voice from a woman who was not trying to be condescending, who actually believed she was offering something. Leona did not argue. She thanked them for coming. She watched them through the window as they crossed the property toward the road. And there at the fence line was Taft Dace. He had been there long enough to hear most of it. As Eugenia strode past him, he nodded. She nodded back. Not the nod of strangers, the nod of people who had spoken before and agreed about something. Leona stood at the window and watched that exchange for a long moment. Taft was looking at the hillside, not at Eugenia, not at the departing women. Looking at the hillside with the quiet attention of a man who had been thinking about something for a while and was now thinking about it more carefully. She understood then that whatever was developing between those two had nothing to do with concern for her welfare. She turned away from the window. She had work to do, and the tunnel's first real answer was still 3 weeks away. The wood changed on a Tuesday. Leona had stopped counting the days exactly, which was itself a kind of discipline. Counting days made the waiting into a test she could fail. Not counting made it into work she was simply doing. She checked the tunnel every few days, opened the door, reached in, touched a log near the entrance, and a log near the back, noted what she found, and closed the door again. She did not allow herself to linger. Either the system was working or it was not, and her standing inside the tunnel worrying about it would change nothing. On that Tuesday in late November, she opened the door in the gray early morning and reached for the nearest log. Her hand stopped. The surface was dry, not completely dry. Not the pale gold of fully seasoned timber, but the distinct and unmistakable dryness of wood that had lost a significant portion of its moisture. The bark had begun to separate slightly from the wood beneath it, the way bark does when the wood underneath contracts as it dries. She pressed her thumb hard against the end grain and felt resistance instead of the soft give of wet fiber. She reached further in past the first rack to a log near the middle of the tunnel. Same thing, drier than it had been. She pulled that log slightly toward her and lifted one end. It was lighter, not dramatically lighter, but measurably lighter, and anyone who has spent time around Greenwood knows that the weight difference between wet and dry is not subtle once the process is underway. Then she noticed the smell, the sharp, resinous smell of fresh-cut sap which had filled the tunnel when she first loaded it had changed. It was still present, but softer layered now, under a warmer and woodier smell. The smell of timber settling into itself as moisture leaves it. The smell of the tunnel in Czech Republic she imagined, though she had never been there. The smell of what Stellan had drawn on that receipt. She stood with her hand on the log, and felt something move through her that was not quite relief and not quite joy. It was more complicated than either of those. The system was working, which meant Stellan had been right, which meant she had remembered correctly, which meant Harwell and Eugenia Strom had been wrong. All of that was true, and she registered all of it. But underneath the confirmation was something else, something she had not anticipated. If Stellan was right, then he was right without being here to know it. He had carried this knowledge across an ocean and taught it to his daughter on a winter afternoon and died before either of them had a hillside to use it on. He would never stand in this tunnel. He would never touch this wood. He would never know that the system he had described on a feed receipt in 1869 was in November of 1873, quietly pulling moisture out of 2 cords of Minnesota timber at the rate of something small and steady and unstoppable. Leona stood in the tunnel entrance for longer than she had allowed herself to stand there in weeks. Then she closed the door and went back to the cabin and built up the morning fire and did not speak to anyone because there was no one to speak to, which was a fact about her life that she had mostly made her peace with, except on mornings like this one. The first real cold arrived that same week. Not the sharp-edged chill of October or the gray, persistent cold of early November, but the settled deep cold of a Minnesota winter that has decided to be serious. Temperatures in the 20s at night, single digits on the worst days, the kind of cold that finds every gap in a wall and every thin spot in a roof and reminds a structure of all its weaknesses simultaneously. Leona's cabin was small and imperfect, but it had a good fireplace, and she knew how to run a fire efficiently, and the small stack of commercially purchased wood she had laid in carried her through those early weeks while the tunnel continued its work. She was burning less than she had expected. The cabin was easier to heat than she had anticipated, partly because of its size, and partly because she had chinked the walls carefully and kept the door discipline that frontier living required, which is the discipline of not standing in open doorways, letting cold air trade places with warm. She was aware from the smoke she could see rising from chimneys visible through the trees that her neighbors were not having the same experience. The Cray place half a mile to the south produced a thick, dark smoke that Leona recognized without needing to see the wood producing it. Green wood improperly dried, fighting to burn, in a fireplace it was not ready for. The Cray household had children, 2 of them young enough that their names had not yet reached Leona in the limited social exchange she had managed since arriving. She had seen Bartley Cray twice, once at the land office in early September when she was filing her claim, and once on the road when he had driven past in a wagon without stopping. He was a broad man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to being correct about things, which was a particular kind of bearing she had learned to notice. The Strom household, further away but visible on clear days, burned steadily. Emmett Strom had a professional supply of wood, whatever its quality, and the resources to burn through it at whatever rate the cold demanded. His smoke was lighter than the Cray's, but still not the clean, pale thread of fully dry timber. Even a woodyard operator, it turned out, did not necessarily have access to wood seasoned to its full potential. Leona watched these columns of smoke the way Stellan had taught her to watch weather, not with judgment, but with attention. Information was information. The smoke told her things. The tunnel held no surprises until the morning in early December, when it held a large one. She had gone in for her regular check, moving to the middle section, where the second batch of logs had been aging for 3 weeks, when she noticed the east wall. A section of timber lining, perhaps 3 feet long, had bowed inward. Not collapsed, not failed, but visibly deformed, the vertical planks bent 4 inches out of true by pressure from outside. One of the horizontal cross members had cracked along its length. Leona crouched and examined it. She put her hand against the bowed planks and felt the pressure behind them steady and significant. She looked at the ceiling above the damaged section. No cracking there. She looked at the floor below. No heaving. She walked back out of the tunnel and sat down on the cold ground outside the entrance and did not go back inside for a few minutes. Stellan had never mentioned what happened when freeze-thaw cycles in Minnesota clay exerted lateral pressure on timber lining during the weeks before the ground fully hardened for winter. Because he had never built one of these in Minnesota, he had described a system he had observed in another country. He had given her the principles. He had not been able to give her every variable. Harwell's words were there again, immediate and uncomfortable. Memory is tender and sometimes not fully accurate. Eugenia Strom's softer version of the same thing. And now here was evidence that the memory had not in fact covered everything. Leona sat on the cold ground and let herself sit with that for exactly as long as she needed to sit with it, which turned out to be about 10 minutes. Then she began to think. The bowing was caused by pressure from outside the tunnel wall. That pressure was coming from the soil, going through repeated small freeze-thaw cycles, the surface freezing overnight and releasing slightly during the warmer midday hours, each cycle moving the clay incrementally against the weakest point of the tunnel structure. Stellan had given her the principles. One of those principles was that structures failed when forces exceeded their resistance. The timber lining had been built to resist the static weight of the earth above it, not the lateral movement of freezing clay beside it. The fix was not complicated. Additional horizontal bracing cross members installed at shorter intervals in the affected section would distribute the lateral force across more points of resistance and stop the deformation. This was not in Stellan's description. This was her own reasoning applied to his principles, which meant Stellan had not failed her. He had given her something more durable than a complete set of instructions. He had given her a way of thinking about problems involving earth and timber and force and moisture, and that way of thinking was now producing a solution he had never specifically taught. She went to the tool shed, got what she needed, and spent the rest of the morning inside the tunnel reinforcing the east wall. By midday, the section was sound. She examined the rest of the lining, carefully found 2 other spots that showed early signs of similar stress, and braced those preemptively. When she came out of the tunnel in the early afternoon, her hands were cold, and her back was informing her of its objections in the usual detailed way, and she stood in the thin December sunlight and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since October. Not because the problem was solved, though it was, because she had solved it herself with reasoning rather than memory, and the reasoning had worked. She understood something about her father that afternoon that she had not fully understood before. He had taught her the principles instead of the procedures because principles travel further. They survive the ocean crossing. They work in Minnesota clay when the check instructions do not account for Minnesota clay. He had given her the most portable thing he had. She fell asleep that night with a quiet she had not felt since August. The second week of December brought Bartley Cray to her door. He came in the morning without announcement and knocked with the firm knock of a man who expected doors to open promptly. When Leona opened it, he was standing, straight hat on coat, buttoned with the expression of someone who had prepared what he intended to say and intended to say it clearly. He said he had heard something he wanted to address directly. There was talk in the area, he said, that she was taking wood from government timberland. That was why there was no wood pile visible on her property. He was not accusing her, he said. He was asking. Because there were children in the area, and he did not intend for them to grow up thinking that taking what was not yours was an acceptable way of managing a difficult situation. Leona went inside and came back with her land certificate. She held it out so he could read it clearly. 5 acres on the ridge, her name, the date of purchase. She pointed to the hillside above the cabin. Every tree on that slope is mine, she said. I have been cutting timber from my own land. Cray took the certificate and read it. He was thorough about it, which she respected, even if she did not enjoy the circumstance. He handed it back. He said he was sorry for the implication. He did not ask where the wood was. There was no wood pile. She had shown him she owned the trees. He accepted that and left. Leona went back inside and sat at the table. Bartley Cray had come to her door and suggested she might be a thief and had left satisfied by documentation. He had not treated her with cruelty. He had not been unreasonable. He had done what a man who believed in order and fairness would do when presented with a concern. And yet she had been required to prove herself to him in a way that she suspected none of her male neighbors had been required to prove themselves to anyone. She thought about who had started the rumor. She thought about what Taft Dace had been doing with his time. Since that morning, he had stood at the fence line watching Eugenia Strome's delegation leave. 3 days later, she found out with more certainty. She walked into Duluth for salt and a few other supplies, and a woman she had never met, the wife of a mill worker, made conversation with her in the general store without knowing who she was, and mentioned casually that people were saying the girl on the ridge was probably cutting government timber because nobody had wood without showing where it came from. The woman said it the way people say things they have heard from someone who seemed reliable and have not yet thought too hard about. Leona bought her salt and walked home, and on the way she thought about Taft Dace's wide face and his smile that went nowhere past his mouth, and she thought about what he wanted and what he was willing to do to get it. He wanted her land. He had wanted it before she bought it, and he had not stopped wanting it since. The offer of $7 was still notionally available. What he was doing now, she understood, was creating a slow pressure. If the community came to believe she was taking timber illegally, the pressure that resulted might eventually make her land difficult to hold. A woman alone on a hillside with a legal problem and no allies was a woman who might eventually sell at a disadvantageous price. It was not a complicated strategy. It was the strategy of a patient man who understood that he had more time than she did. The sixth week arrived in the last days of November by her reckoning, and the wood was done. She split a test log with her axe and held the two halves up in the thin winter light. The cut surface was dry through the pale gold color of properly seasoned timber, all the way to the center, no dark moisture at the heart. She took a small chip and held her match to it. It caught immediately, the flame clean and hot, burning without the sputtering and smoke and reluctant character of green wood. She carried an armload into the cabin and built a fire. The logs caught quickly, the flames settling into the deep orange-red color of wood burning at its proper efficiency. The cabin reached 60 degrees in under an hour with less wood than she had been burning from her commercial stock. The heat from those logs was full and immediate and lasted. She sat in front of the fire and did not do anything else for a while. Emmett Strom arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of December, in a day that was cold but not yet brutal. The sky, the pale gray of a winter that has not yet decided how serious it intends to be. He was a large man, 50 or so, with the careful movements of someone who had spent decades around heavy timber and had learned to move deliberately because the consequences of carelessness were serious. He had a professional's eye and a professional's manner, direct and assessing without being impolite. He told her he had heard she had good wood. He said it plainly without pretense. Someone had mentioned it, he said. He had been selling and managing wood for 20 years, and he was curious. He asked if he could see what she had. Leona led him around the back of the cabin and up the slope to the tunnel entrance. She opened the door and held her lamp inside so the light fell across the racks and the logs stacked on them. Emmett stepped in and stopped. He reached out and took a log off the nearest rack. He turned it in his hands. He pressed his thumb into the end grain. He knocked on the side of it with his knuckles, the hollow sound of properly dried timber, the sound that experienced woodmen recognize the way musicians recognize a tuned instrument. He lifted it, feeling the weight or the lack of it. He set that log down and took another from further back in the tunnel. Same examination, same result. He stood with the second log in his hands and looked around the tunnel, at the sloped ceiling, at the vent shaft opening at the far end, at the orderly racks holding 2 cords of wood that had been green timber 6 weeks before. He said, "This wood is drier than anything in my yard." He said it to himself more than to her. Then he looked at her directly and said, "I want to buy this knowledge. Whatever you have done here, I want to be able to do it at the yard." He said $25. Leona looked at him. She said, "What would you do with it?" He said he would build similar tunnels at the lumberyard. Season wood underground through the summer, sell it as premium seasoned stock at a higher price. He said it straightforwardly, as a businessman states his intentions. Leona said, "My father learned this from Czech foresters who had developed it across generations. They shared it because people's lives in winter depended on good wood. He taught it to me the same way. If you want to use this system to sell expensive wood to people who can't afford expensive wood, and the families who cannot afford it keep burning green timber through January, then you are using it for the opposite of what it was built for." Emmett looked at her for a long moment. He was not an easy man to surprise, and she had surprised him. He was accustomed to purchasing things, and he had not recently encountered something he could not purchase. He said he needed to think about it. He put his hat back on and left the tunnel and walked back toward the road with the measured, careful tread of a man revising something. Leona watched him go. She felt the familiar quiet of having said exactly what needed to be said. She thought about Stellan, who had also been a man with careful movements, who had also understood the weight of things. That night, she sat by the fire longer than usual. There was a loneliness in the day that she had not expected. Emmett Strom had walked into that tunnel and understood immediately what it was. He had touched the wood and known. She had watched his face change when he registered what he was holding, and for one brief moment, it had felt like showing something to someone who could appreciate it fully, which was a feeling she had not had since Stellan died. And then the moment had passed, and he had put a price on it and left. She told herself that was fine. It was fine. She banked the fire for the night. 3 days before Christmas, on a night when the temperature had dropped to zero and a thin, hard crust of snow had frozen over the ground, Leona woke up at 2 in the morning. She lay still for a moment the way you do when something has pulled you out of sleep, but you are not yet sure what. Then she heard it again, a sound from the direction of the hillside. Not the wind, something more deliberate than wind. She got up, put on her coat and boots and took her lamp outside. The tunnel entrance door was standing 3 inches open. She crossed the frozen ground quickly and pushed the door fully open and held the lamp inside. The racks were intact. The wood was undisturbed. Nothing had been taken. But the door had been closed when she had checked it at sunset. It had not blown open. It had a wooden latch and a weight against it to keep it seated, and the latch was up. She stood at the entrance and held the lamp so the light fell on the ground in front of the door. The frozen snow crust held impressions better than loose snow. There were boot prints, coming from the east from the direction of Taft Dace's farm, crossing the open ground to the tunnel entrance, and going back the same way. The return prints were deeper and further apart than the approach prints, the gait of someone who had heard or seen something and left quickly. Leona stood in the dark and the cold for a long moment. Then she closed the tunnel door, latched it securely, and went back inside. She did not sleep particularly well for the rest of the night. In the morning, she went to the tool shed and found materials to build a heavier latch, a sliding wooden bar that required deliberate effort to open from outside, the kind of mechanism that made clear to anyone approaching that entry was not casual or accidental. She installed it herself that morning in the cold, and by midday, the tunnel door had a fastening that announced its intentions plainly. That same afternoon, she was walking back from checking the upper vent when she saw Taft Dace on the road that ran between their properties. He was moving without particular purpose, the way a man moves when he wants to appear, as if he is simply going somewhere rather than waiting for something. Leona stopped and looked at him. He stopped and looked back. She said, "I put a new latch on the tunnel door last night. If you need wood this winter, you can come and ask me directly." He said he did not know what she was referring to. His voice was easy and untroubled. He said it the way a man says something he has decided to say regardless of what he actually knows. Leona nodded once. She said, "The offer stands." Then she continued up the slope. On the afternoon of January 18th, she walked outside to bring in the evening's wood and stopped. The sky to the west was the color she had seen her father stop and look at once years ago on an afternoon in December when she was perhaps 12. He had stopped mid-stride and gone very still, and when she asked what he was looking at, he had said that color means something is coming that we should respect. The western sky was the same color now, a particular gray with yellow underneath it, not the clean gray of ordinary overcast, but the heavy bruised gray of air carrying enormous amounts of moisture and cold together. The wind had shifted to the northwest in the last hour, which she noticed because the sound at the cabin corners had changed. And from the direction of the timber on the upper ridge, nothing. No sound at all. No birds, no small movements in the branches. The forest had gone quiet in the way forests go quiet when the animals have already made their decisions and settled in. Leona changed her plan for the evening. She spent the next 4 hours moving wood. Not a week's worth, not even 10 days worth. 2 weeks. She filled every available corner of the cabin until there was only a narrow path from the door to the fireplace to the bed. She filled the space under the table and stacked logs against the wall opposite the fireplace until the stack was shoulder high. When she came inside for the last time, the sky had darkened to a deep iron color and the wind had picked up substantially. She latched the cabin door and built the evening fire and ate a small meal and listened to the wind increase by increments each hour, a little harder than the last. At 9 o'clock that night, the storm arrived. Not arrived the way weather arrives, gradually with warning. Arrived the way a door slams all at once, the full weight of it against the cabin walls. The temperature outside dropped from 15 degrees to something that cracked the wood of the window frame audibly within the first hour. The wind went from hard to structural, the kind of wind that does not gust, but pushes a sustained force that leaned against everything in its path and did not stop. The snow was not falling. It was moving horizontally, driven by the wind, so that it was indistinguishable from the wind itself. Leona lay in her bunk that night and listened to the storm work on the cabin and thought about all the cabins within 10 miles of her and about all the wood piles in front of those cabins and about what green wood does in a fireplace when the temperature outside is dropping past zero and keeps going. She thought about Bartley Cray's children. She thought about what the next several days were going to look like. She thought about the tunnel solid in the hillside behind her full of wood that burned, the way wood was supposed to burn, and she understood for the first time with complete clarity that what Stellan had given her was not a technique for making winter comfortable. It was a technique for surviving the kind of night that had just begun outside her walls. By the second night of the storm, the cold had become a presence rather than a condition. It was not simply that the temperature had dropped. Temperature is a number. What settled over the Duluth Ridge country on the night of January 19th was something with weight and intention, something that pushed against every structure and found the gaps and moved through them with the patience of a thing that knows it will eventually win. The wind sustained at 45 miles an hour without gusting, which meant it did not come in waves that gave a wall time to recover. It pushed constantly, a single unbroken force, and the cabins and barns and outbuildings of the surrounding farms bent to it the way anything bends to something stronger that does not stop. Leona's cabin held. She had built it small and low, and she had chinked every gap herself, and she knew where every weakness was and had addressed most of them before winter came. The fireplace took her seasoned wood and gave back steady heat, and the cabin stayed at 60 degrees, while outside the temperature dropped through zero and kept going, reaching 20 below by midnight and still descending. She slept in her clothes. Sometime after midnight on the second night, she heard something. A knock, then silence, then nothing more. She got up and opened the door. The cold hit her like a fist. The step was empty, but in the lamplight pressed into the new snow on the ground were boot prints. Someone had walked to her door, raised a hand, and then turned back into the storm. The prints led away toward the south in the direction of the Cray farm, and the wind was already softening their edges. Whoever it was had not been ready to ask yet. Leona stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out into the dark, then closed the door and went back to her bunk. Pride and cold were having a conversation she was not part of. Not yet. She did not blame whoever it was for turning back. She understood the particular paralysis of needing help from someone you have already wronged. She had watched Alistair Greer lay $15 on a table rather than look her in the face, which was its own version of the same thing. People turned away from doors they should have walked through because walking through them required admitting something they were not yet ready to admit. The cold would eventually make the admission easier. It always did. Cold was in that sense honest. It did not allow you to maintain positions that were costing you more than you could afford. On the morning of the third day, she heard a different knock, this one steady and deliberate. She crossed to the door and opened it, and the cold came in like a wall. Bartley Cray was standing on her step. He was not the man she had seen twice before, the broad and certain man with the bearing of someone accustomed to being correct. The man on her step had been walked through something. His beard was frozen on one side, and his coat was wet through the shoulders where the driven snow had found the seams, and he was holding himself with the slightly rigid posture of a man who has been cold for long enough that his body has started making decisions about warmth that override other concerns. He had walked half a mile in this. Leona stepped back from the door without speaking. He came in and she closed it behind him, and he stood in the center of the small cabin and looked at the fire. The fire was burning the way fires burn, when the wood feeding them is exactly right, deep and even, and sustain the logs settling, rather than fighting the heat coming off in layers, rather than in the irregular surges that green wood produces. Cray looked at it, waited for a long time. Then he said, "My children have not been warm since yesterday morning. The cabin is at 40 degrees. I cannot get it higher. The wood will not burn the way it should." He was not asking. He was stating facts. But the facts were a request. Leona said, "How much can you carry?" He looked at her. Something moved across his face, something between relief and the specific pain of a proud man receiving help he could not have provided for himself. He said he could carry what she could spare. She pulled on her coat and took her lamp and led him around the back of the cabin and up the slope to the tunnel. The new latch she had installed after Christmas slid back cleanly under her hand. She opened the door and the smell came out, that warm, dry, woody smell that meant the system was doing what it was supposed to do. Cray stepped inside and stopped. He had clearly not known what he was walking into. He had heard something enough to bring him here through this weather, but the knowing and the seeing were different things. He stood in the entrance of the tunnel and looked at the racks and the logs stacked on them, dry in the lamplight, the pale gold color of wood that was ready, all of it ready in an underground chamber on a hillside, while outside the storm was killing fires across the whole county. He reached out and took a log off the nearest rack. He just held it, feeling the weight of it, and his face said everything about what the weight told him. He loaded what he could carry in 2 trips. On the second trip, he stopped at the tunnel entrance and looked at Leona with an expression she did not have a name for immediately. It was not simply gratitude. It was the expression of a man who has built a picture of someone in his mind and is now looking at the actual person and finding that the picture was wrong in ways he is not entirely comfortable with. He said, "I came to your door in December and suggested you might be a thief." Leona said, "You saw a document and you were satisfied. That was fair." He said, "It was not fair. I'd already decided something about you before I came. The document did not change what I had decided. It only gave me a reason to leave." He paused. His children were cold, and he had 2 loads of good wood under his arms, and he was taking the time to say this, which cost him something. He said, "I was wrong about you." Leona looked at him. She said, "Take care of your children." He nodded and went. By midday of the 3rd day, the word had moved through the storm on foot. There was no other way for word to move in conditions like these. It moved the way all urgent information moves in isolated communities, person to person, each person sending the next a chain of cold and necessity. The girl on the ridge had dry wood. Her fire was burning. She had wood to spare. Families sent whoever could walk fastest through the snow, sometimes a father, sometimes an older son, once a pair of teenage brothers who arrived together because neither one would let the other go alone in that wind. They came with sleds and with their arms and with feed sacks and with whatever they had to carry wood in, and they went to the tunnel and they loaded what she could spare, and they went back. Each one stopped when they first stepped inside. Every single one. The stopping was involuntary. The reflexive pause of a person whose senses are reporting something that contradicts what they believe to be true. Underground was wet. Underground was where things rotted. Underground was where you did not put anything you intended to keep. And yet here was this chamber smelling of dry timber holding wood that was measurably, tangibly, undeniably in better condition than anything they had stacked outside their own homes. Leona kept count as the days accumulated. By the end of the 4th day, 12 households had sent someone to the tunnel. 12 times she had slid that latch back and held the lamp and watched a person step inside and go still. 12 sets of hands reaching for wood that should not have been dry and discovering that it was. The ones who came on day 3 were the most desperate, and desperation made them quick. They loaded and went without asking much. But by day 4, something had shifted. People were arriving with questions in addition to empty sleds. A farmer named Croft sent his eldest son, a young man of perhaps 17, who loaded his sled and then stood at the tunnel entrance for a long minute, staring at the vent shaft where it disappeared upward through the earth. He asked, "The air moves through by itself, no pump." Leona said, "Temperature does the work." He looked at the hillside the way a person looks at something they intend to remember, then shouldered his load and went. A woman came alone on the afternoon of day 4, her husband having broken his ankle on ice 2 weeks before the storm. She was perhaps 50, her face weathered in the way of women who have spent decades outdoors. She did not ask any questions. She stepped into the tunnel, ran her hand along a log. The full length of it, lifted it, set it down. She picked up a second log and did the same. Then she looked at Leona and said simply, "Your father knew what he was doing." Leona said yes. The woman loaded her sled in silence, and that silence felt like a different kind of acknowledgement than words would have been. She explained the system to the first few who asked. After that, she let the tunnel explain itself. People who touched the wood understood what they needed to understand. But she noticed something in those first days that she had not anticipated. Each person who left the tunnel left changed in a small but specific way. Not converted to any new belief, not dramatically altered. Just slightly recalibrated. The way a person is recalibrated when something they assumed was fixed turns out to be movable. Underground wood dries. A hillside you cannot farm can be worth more than farmland. A girl who came here with $15 knew something that a man with 20 years in the timber trade did not. These were small corrections to a long-held map of how things worked, and she watched people make them as they hefted logs and turned back into the storm. On the 4th day, Emmett Strom came. He had waited longer than the others, which she understood without needing it explained. He was a man who sold wood. He had a yard full of it. He had the resources to burn through difficulty in a way that other families did not. And he had, she suspected, a particular reluctance to be seen arriving at the door of a 21-year-old woman with a request that implicitly acknowledged something significant about the state of his own product. But he came. The storm did not negotiate with reluctance. He came in and stood in the center of the cabin and looked at the fire. He had seen the fire before in December. He had assessed it with a professional eye and understood what it meant. He was not surprised by the quality of the burn. What he was looking at now was something else. He said, "I have been burning since the storm started. My household has not been comfortable. The wood I have been burning is wood I selected myself from my own stock, right? The best seasoned wood in my yard by my own judgment." He stopped. He seemed to be deciding whether to continue. He said, "I have been in this business for 20 years. I know good wood. What I have in my yard is good wood by every standard I have ever applied. And for 4 days, it has not been enough." Leona waited. He said, "I came to your door in December and offered to buy what you know. You told me why you would not sell it on those terms. I've been thinking about what you said since then." He looked at her directly. He said, "You were right." This was not a small thing for a man like Emmett Strom to say. Leona recognized the cost of it. She said, "My father was a forestry worker. He was not a businessman. He understood wood the way some people understand a language they were born into, not as something they learned, but as something they knew. He learned this system from men who shared it freely because they understood that knowledge about how to survive winter was not a competitive advantage. It was a responsibility." Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she had not expected. He said, "I have thought about that since December, about what it means that I have been selling wood for 20 years and did not know this was possible, about the families who have been burning twice what they needed to burn every winter because nobody in the trade had any reason to figure this out and share it." He was not being sentimental. He was a practical man accounting for something in the ledger of what he had and had not done. She watched him do it. She led him to the tunnel. He went in and she let him stand there as long as he needed, which was longer than the others had needed because he was calculating more things than the others had been calculating. When he came back out, he looked at the hillside for a moment at the south-facing entrance and the vent shaft visible above them on the upper slope, and she could see him working through the mechanics of it with a professional's eye. He said, "I want to come back after the storm." She said she would be here. On the 6th day, 2 things happened that Leona had not anticipated in the same order she had anticipated them. The first was Taft Dace. He arrived in the late morning alone without his usual manner of easy friendliness. The manner was gone in a way that suggested he had not had the energy to sustain it through 6 days of crisis. He had the look of a man who had burned through his options methodically and had arrived at the last one. He said his heat source was gone. He did not explain the details. He stood at her door and stated the fact without the architecture of pleasantness he usually built around things he wanted. Leona looked at him. She thought about the tunnel door standing open on the night before Christmas and the boot prints in the frozen crust and the weeks of quiet pressure he had applied through rumors and through that nod exchanged with Eugenia Strom at the fence line. She thought about all of it. She also thought about Stellan, who had said, "Do not waste your strength on battles the ground has already decided." And she thought about something else Stellan had said, something she had not thought about in years. He had said it once about a man in their neighborhood in the Czech lands who had caused the family trouble, a man who had taken something that was not his and made difficulties and been unpleasant, in the ways that people who want what others have are often unpleasant. Leona had asked her father why he had helped that man the following winter when the man's firewood ran short. Stellan had said because the cold does not know what he did, and neither should the wood. Leona stepped aside from the door. She said the tunnel is behind the cabin, take enough for 3 days. Taft Dace stepped inside out of the wind. He did not thank her immediately. He stood for a moment as if he was not entirely certain how to receive something he had not earned and had in fact tried to take without permission. Then he said quietly the single word that was all the situation could carry between them, "Thank you." Leona said nothing. She watched him go around the back of the cabin toward the tunnel, and she stood in the open doorway in the cold for a moment longer than was practical, and she thought about her father, and then she went inside and closed the door. That evening after dark, with the storm still pushing in at the walls though, with slightly less force than it had shown at its worst, There was a knock at the door that Leona had been aware in some part of herself was coming. She opened it, and Eugenia Strom was standing there. She was alone. She had brought a lamp that had nearly burned out its flame, small and wavering, and the storm had done things to her coat and her hair that spoke of a walk she had not taken lightly. She was 60 degrees from the composed and certain woman who had stood in this same cabin 8 weeks ago with 4 companions and a settled opinion. Leona stepped back. Eugenia came in. She sat down in the chair by the fire, the only chair, and Leona sat on the edge of the bunk, and for a while neither of them spoke. The fire did what fire does in that kind of silence, which is burn steadily and provide a place for two people to look when looking at each other is too direct. Then Eugenia said, Emmett came home this afternoon with wood from your tunnel. He told me about what you said in December about your father, about why you would not sell the knowledge to him. He told me about today, about what he said to you. She stopped. She looked at the fire. She said I led 4 women to your door in November and told you at what you had built would rot. I told you that memory of the dead was sometimes imprecise. I told you that you were young and alone and that your judgment could not be trusted. I said those things with the certainty of someone who believed she was helping. Leona waited. Eugenia said I was wrong, not partially wrong, not wrong about some of it, wrong in the fundamental thing, which was that I assumed I understood your situation better than you understood it yourself. And I assumed that because you were young and because you were a woman alone and because your father came from somewhere else and had an accent and worked with his hands. And I told myself I was concerned for you, but what I actually was certain. Certain in a way I had not earned. This was harder to hear than anger would have been. Anger could be deflected or absorbed. What Eugenia was saying required something else from Leona, a willingness to receive it fully. And receiving it fully meant acknowledging that the 8 weeks between that November visit and this January night had cost something on both sides. Leona said my father understood things about wood and earth and the way coal works that I have never seen equaled. He understood them in Czech, and he understood them in the broken English he spent 5 years building here. And the language did not change what he knew. It was never about the language. Eugenia said, I know that now. I knew it incorrectly then. Leona looked at her. The woman across the fire from her was not small. She was not a person who found apology easy or habitual. She had walked through a blizzard in the dark to say something she did not have to say to a woman she had condescended to, and she was saying it without decoration or excuse. Leona said my father would have liked you. He liked people who were willing to be wrong once they saw it clearly. He said it was the rarest thing. Eugenia looked at her. Something shifted in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was something in the same direction. She said, he sounds like a man worth knowing. Leona said he was the best person I have ever known. They sat by the fire for a while longer. Then Eugenia put on her coat and picked up her lamp and said goodnight, and Leona stood in the doorway and watched the lamp move away through the dark and the diminishing wind, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since August, and before August, and perhaps since the winter of 1870, when she was 18 years old and the ground had shifted under her feet in a way it never entirely stops shifting when you lose the person who taught you how to stand on it. She closed the door and sat back down by the fire alone. She had come to this hillside with $15 and a folded piece of paper, and a belief that was, if she was honest with herself, not entirely separable from grief. She had believed in the tunnel because Stellan had described it. She had believed in it with the particular intensity of someone who has lost the person they believed in most and is trying to keep holding on to something solid. That was not a bad reason to believe in something. But it was a fragile one, and she had known it was fragile even if she had not admitted it until the night she sat outside the tunnel in the cold with a cracked wall and no answer for it. What she had now was different. She had tested the system and found it sound. She had found the one place where Stellan's description had not accounted for Minnesota conditions, and she had reasoned through it herself. She had kept the knowledge working through October and November and December, and now through 8 days of the worst winter storm the ridge had seen. The belief she carried going to sleep that night was not the belief she had carried out of Alistair Greer's kitchen in August. That one had been faith born of love. This one was something sturdier. It had been earned through frozen hands and cracked palms and 10 minutes sitting in the cold deciding not to give up. She thought about Stellan, about the way he had folded that receipt and put it in her pocket without making a ceremony of it. He had not said, "This is the most important thing I will ever teach you." He had not said, "Remember this when I am gone." He had simply put the folded paper in her coat pocket the way you put something useful where it will be found when needed. He had trusted her to need it. He had trusted her to find it useful when she did. She went to bed and slept without difficulty for the first time since the storm had started. The storm ended on January 27th. 8 days. The final count was 8 days of sustained temperatures between 20 and 30 below zero, with wind that did not drop below 30 miles an hour for the first 5 days, and did not fully quiet until the morning of the 8th. When it ended quickly, the way these storms end in Minnesota, the wind dropping over the course of a few hours until the air was simply still and very cold and the world was buried in white and completely silent. Leona opened her cabin door on the morning of the 28th and stood in the entrance and breathed cold, clean air and looked at the ridge above her. The tunnel vent shaft on the upper slope had a small cap of accumulated snow over it. She would clear that later. The entrance door was intact. The cabin behind her was intact. She had wood remaining, not a great deal, but some, which meant she had calculated correctly or come close enough to correctly that the difference did not matter. She walked around the property. The snow was deep thigh-high in places where it had drifted knee-high in the more open areas. The sky was the particular blue that appears after a major storm, a blue so clear and deep, it seemed to have been scoured to that color by everything that had just passed through. She climbed to the top of the ridge above the tunnel, which she had not done since October. From up there, she could see the surrounding land clearly, the farms and cabins visible as dark shapes against the white, each one connected to the others by the thin lines of trampled paths through the snow. She could trace those paths from where she stood. They all converged on her hillside. 12 of them faint but readable, the record of 12 households moving through the worst storm in years toward the one place on the ridge that had what they needed. She stood there for a while in the cold, in the silence, in the sharp, clear light, and thought about the diagram Stellan had sketched on a feed receipt and about the hillsides of Czech Republic, where foresters had worked this system through generations of brutal winters, and about the fact that the knowledge had traveled all that way across an ocean in 20 years, and the death of the man who carried it and had arrived here on this ridge in time to be useful when it was needed. It was not a small thing. She allowed herself standing on the ridge in the January cold to understand that it was not a small thing. Reverend Harwell arrived before noon. He came without the manner he had worn in October, without the organized certainty of a man arriving to manage a situation. He came on afoot, hat in hand, and he stood outside rather than approaching the door, which she noticed because it was unusual and because the cold was serious enough that standing outside was not comfortable. She went to him. He said, "I have spent 8 days inside my house thinking about the conversation we had in October, about what I said to you regarding memory and the dead, and whether you had understood your father correctly." He stopped. He said, "I said those things from a position of authority that I had not examined. I assumed that my experience of living here through Minnesota winters made me more competent to judge your situation than you were to judge it yourself. The storm has given me 8 days to consider how that assumption held up." Leona looked at him. He was not a man who performed humility. What she was seeing was the real thing, uncomfortable and undecorated. She said, "My father believed in work and in the earth and in passing knowledge forward. He would not have found that incompatible with what you believe in, Reverend." Harwell said, "I would like to speak to the community about what you have built, not as a curiosity, as a lesson in paying attention to what people know, rather than to how they appear." Leona said, "The lesson was my father's. I only remembered it when I needed to." Harwell nodded slowly. He put his hat back on and turned back toward the road, and she watched him go, and she thought that he would do what he said he would do, and that it would probably matter to some people and not to others, and that this was the ordinary way that things change gradually and incompletely, and with significant amounts of stubbornness on all sides. She was not disappointed by this. It was what her father had prepared her for. Emmett Strom came back on the second day after the storm when the roads were passable enough for a careful horse, and the sky was still that deep scoured blue. He came without pretense and stated his proposal directly. He wanted to build 3 seasoning tunnels on hillside land he owned near the yard. He wanted Leona to consult on the design and construction. In exchange, he would sell the wood produced by those tunnels at no more than 20% above standard pricing, and he would commit to filling orders from the poorest households in the area first each autumn before the premium buyers, so that the families who needed good winter fuel most urgently would have access before it was gone. He had worked this out himself. She had not suggested it, and she had not asked for it. She looked at him. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I stood in that tunnel during the storm and understood what it was and what it meant that it existed, and nobody in the timber trade had developed it. And I understood what it meant that your father had the knowledge and I had the business and the 20 years in the yard, and the knowledge was in a hillside on 5 acres of bad land owned by a 21-year-old woman who came here with $15 because nobody in the trade had any incentive to figure it out and share it." He said it without self-pity or drama. He was making a ledger entry. He was putting something in the column where something was missing. Leona said, "My father learned this from men who shared it freely. I will tell you everything you need to know." Emmett said, "I expected you to say that." She said, "It will take several days to go through all of it properly." He said he had the time. By the middle of March, when the first real suggestion of spring came through and the quality of the afternoon light, 3 tunnel projects were underway on hillside land around Duluth. 2 of them were on Emmett Strome's property. One was on a parcel belonging to the Croft family, whose eldest son had stood at the tunnel entrance on day 4 of the storm and memorized the hillside with his eyes. His father had come to Leona in early February, hat in hand, and asked if she would explain what she had built. He had listened for 2 hours without interrupting. At the end, he had said, "I have a hillside behind my south pasture that faces the same way." She had walked it with him the following week. The slope was good, the soil was workable. He began digging in March. Leona drew the specifications for all 3 projects. She walked each hillside with the builders the way Stellan had walked her through the principles, explaining not just the steps, but the reasons behind the steps, so that when something unexpected happened, as something always did with earth and timber and slope, the builders would be able to reason toward a solution rather than abandoning the work. She found that she had opinions she had not known she had until she stood on someone else's hillside and looked at it with the eye of a person who had already made every mistake once. She caught 2 positioning errors on the Strome property that would have compromised airflow. She identified a soil condition on the Croft hillside that required a modification to the vent shaft depth. Stellan had given her principles. Working through those 3 projects in the spring of 1874 gave her experience, which was a different kind of knowing. She kept Stellan's receipt in her pocket through all of it. The paper had softened with handling until it was more textile than paper, but the lines of the diagram were still legible if you knew how to read them. The slope and the entrance and the vent and the arrows showing the movement of air through a tunnel that her father had drawn in a workshop in 1869, while explaining to his daughter why the poor man always burned twice what he should have to. Taft Dace came to her in the first week of March. He came without his usual performance of friendliness, which she had come to understand was not actually meanness underneath, but something more complicated, a man who had lived close to the edge of losing things for long enough that taking what was available had become habit rather than character. He stood at the edge of her property and said he knew she had no reason to want his help. He said he was good with a shovel, and he knew hard ground, and he could work long days. He said he would take standard day wages and no more. He said he was not asking for anything except the work. Leona looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the boot prints in the frozen snow in December. She thought about the rumors he had sent through the community. She thought about Bartley Cray arriving at her door in the conviction that she might be a thief. She also thought about the fact that she had 3 tunnel projects to consult on and a 4th to build on her own land, and that winter came back every year without asking whether she was ready. She said, "I pay at the end of each week. You take direction without argument. If I ask you to do something a particular way, you do it that way." He said agreed. She put him to work the following Monday. The first week was cautious on both sides, which was the appropriate way to begin work between 2 people who both knew what had passed between them. Taft moved earth the way he had said he would, steadily and without complaint, and he took direction without the minor resistance that some men inserted into instructions given by someone younger than themselves and female. He did not try to explain to her how the slope should be graded or suggest that maybe the vent shaft ought to go somewhere different. He dug where she said to dig and stopped when she said to stop, and asked questions that were genuine questions rather than arguments wearing a question's clothes. By the 3rd week, something had shifted to a working equilibrium. Not friendship, not forgiveness in any formal sense, but the practical trust that develops between people doing difficult physical work together when each one does their part. She noticed that he remembered details from one day to the next, which was the sign of a man who was actually paying attention rather than simply complying. He asked one afternoon why the rack height mattered, why 6 inches off the floor instead of 3. She explained. He nodded and did not ask again. The next day, she caught him correcting the placement of a rack board without being told, adjusting it to match the specifications she had given. He did not mention that he had done it. She did not mention it either. She did not forgive him in the way that forgiveness gets talked about, the formal thing with words and acknowledgement. What she did was more practical and perhaps more honest. She hired a man who knew how to move earth and paid him fairly and worked alongside him. And over the weeks of that first spring, she found that he was exactly what he had said. He was capable and direct and willing to take direction. Stellan had taught her that too, though, not in words. He had taught it by example, by the way he moved through the world without carrying grudges as if they were tools he might need. He had seemed to understand that carrying old grievances used the same hands that were needed for present work, and that present work was always more urgent. She had been an apprentice at her father's knowledge for most of her life, and she was still learning from him years after he was gone, which was, she thought, the measure of what a teacher actually was. Leona Grady lived on those 5 acres for 7 years. She married at 24 a man named Denton Stroud, who had come to Minnesota from Ohio and worked timber and had heard about the tunnel on the ridge before he ever met the woman who built it. He had sought her out with the specific intention of understanding the system, and in the process of understanding it, he had come to understand her, and he had been honest enough with himself to recognize that the two understandings were connected. They built 2 more tunnels together on the expanded property, and she taught him everything Stellan had taught her, and he learned it the way good students learn things, not just the procedures, but the reasoning behind them. In the second winter after the storm, the Strom tunnels produced their first full commercial yield of underground seasoned wood. Emmett Strom priced it as he had promised, no more than 20% above standard stock, and held back the first allocation for the households that had the least. He did not advertise this. He did not seek recognition for it. He simply did it in the way that a practical man does something he has decided is the correct thing to do. Leona heard about it from a woman at the general store who said she had gotten better wood that winter than she had ever been able to afford before and did not know why. Leona said nothing. She went home and thought about Stellan, who had said the knowledge spreads when the people who hold it decide that holding it alone is the smaller thing. By 1876, there were 7 underground seasoning tunnels operating on hillside land within 20 miles of Duluth. None of them gave Stellan Grady credit. None of them knew his name. The knowledge traveled the way useful knowledge travels when it is allowed to travel freely, without ceremony, without attribution, passing from person to person, through demonstration and conversation, and the simple evidence of wood that burned the way it was supposed to burn. She died in 1931 at 79 years old in the house she and Denton had built together on the ridge, in a bedroom with a window that looked out over the hillside where the original tunnel still ran back into the earth. The Duluth Historical Society documented the tunnel that year. The original timber lining was sound after 58 years, the cross members solid, the vent shaft clear. Engineers who came to examine it confirmed what Stellan Grady had understood from the Czech foresters, who had taught him the slope-driven convection system functioned without maintenance, without mechanical assistance, indefinitely as long as the tunnel structure remained intact. They wrote their findings in a report that named the site by location and described the mechanism with precision and attributed the design to regional frontier ingenuity. They did not know Stellan's name. There was no reason they would. He had come to Minnesota in 1865 and worked 5 years and died in the winter of 1870, and left no record that a county historical society would have encountered, only a knowledge carried in his daughter's memory and expressed in a hillside 2 miles outside Duluth. He had arrived in this country with a way of seeing forests that most people around him did not share. He had understood trees as systems rather than as raw material, understood the relationship between moisture and heat and the particular behavior of Minnesota winters in a way that came from decades of careful attention. He had worked alongside men who cut more wood and earned more money and built bigger operations, and died without ever knowing what he knew. He had died with it mostly untransmitted, except for one afternoon in a workshop with a daughter who had been paying attention, and a diagram on a feed receipt that she had kept in her coat pocket for 3 years, waiting for a hillside. The engineer's report called it regional frontier ingenuity. Leona read that phrase once and did not disagree with it exactly, but she also did not agree with it exactly. It was not frontier ingenuity. It was Czech forestry knowledge carried by a man who had understood that the most important things you could give your children were not money or land or connections, but the ability to think clearly about the problems they were going to face after you were gone. Leona had never corrected anyone who failed to ask. She had not needed to. She had known whose knowledge it was every day she worked with it every winter. It kept her warm. Every morning she opened the tunnel door and smelled the wood drying in the dark. She had known it when she handed Bartley Cray his first armload of dry timber in the worst storm she would ever see. She had known it when she sat across the fire from Eugenia Strom and heard a proud woman find her way to honesty. She had known it when she walked the hillsides with builders and told them not just what to do but why, so that the knowledge would travel further than she could take it herself. She had known it always. The knowledge was her father's. Everything she had done with it was hers. On the morning of January 28, 1874, the day the storm ended, Leona stood in the tunnel entrance with her lamp and heard the 12 knocks of those dark, stormy nights again in her memory. She had opened that door 12 times while the storm pushed against everything outside. She had opened it for Bartley Cray, who had wrongly suspected her, and came anyway because his children were cold. She had opened it for Emmett Strom, who had tried to buy what she knew and came back having understood why she would not sell it on those terms. She had opened it for Taft Dace, who had tried to take it without asking and came back because the cold did not know what he had done. She had opened it for people she knew and people she barely knew, and for two teenage boys she had never seen before who arrived together in the storm holding onto each other's sleeves. She had opened the door at every time. Stellan had not taught her that either. Not in words, but she had learned it from him the way you learn the most important things by watching someone live according to a principle until the principle becomes visible, until you can see the shape of it clearly enough to carry it yourself. She stood in the tunnel entrance in the clean, cold air of the morning after the storm and looked down the slope toward the cabin and the road in the wider world. And she thought about her father, who had given her a hillside she had never stood on and a knowledge she had tested until it held. And she thought it held. It held through October, and it held through December, and it held through 8 days of the worst weather Minnesota had put in front of her, and it would hold next winter. And the winter after that, because the physics did not change, and the slope did not change, and the cold would always come, and people would always need wood that burned the way wood was supposed to burn. She closed the tunnel door. She walked back down the slope toward the cabin. The morning was very quiet and very cold and very bright, and somewhere in the trees a bird was making a sound that meant the worst was over. She thought, "Thank you, Father." Then she went inside to build the morning fire.